everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches coming to you from the Cuban mission in New York City following the UN General Assembly. I'm pleased to be joined by Cuba's Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodríguez. Foreign Minister Rodríguez, welcome.
It's a pleasure.
So you just had this devastating Hurricane Ian hit Cuba. It also hit Florida and Puerto Rico and caused a huge mess. Can you tell us about the situation in Cuba?
Yeah, let me express our condolences and sympathy to the American citizens and Cubans living in Florida and other states who suffer the impact of the hurricane. But in fact, the situation in Cuba currently is a little bit better. The grid restarted because we had to shut down the whole electric system because of the impact in the western of the country. We suffer 3 losses of life. Is painful. Our condolences to the families and to our people. The devastation in the west is important, mostly in housing, agriculture, tobacco plantations, telecom and electrical networks. But at the same time, we are very resilient, and our people is very well trained for preventing and mitigating natural disasters. A powerful system of civil defense, working in a very tight relation with our people. In Havana City and other neighboring areas, there is a level of damages to the power transmission lines, etc. It is difficult, no? And we suffered recently another catastrophe, a natural catastrophe, because of a lighting provoked a massive fire in a supertanker's port in the east of Havana City. But we are working hard. We received international assistance, and even from the U.S. government, we received condolences and some offers. We deliver our needs, and I feel that in an occasion of natural disasters like Hurricane Ian, could be possible to think in a better way for the sake of both peoples, American people and Cuban people, because this devastating hurricane is also an expression of a connection between both countries.
And of course, this is happening while you're still dealing with a very long 60-year U.S. blockade that I imagine makes it more difficult to respond in some cases to natural disasters like this. And I mean, it's important to note that because we're talking after the UN General Assembly, where I believe 43 countries actually spoke out in their speeches against the blockade on Cuba. And this November is going to mark the 30th anniversary of the UN vote, where the majority of nations around the world vote to condemn the U.S. blockade of Cuba. What is the significance of this anniversary for Cuba?
There is an overwhelming majority, almost unanimity, in the international community supporting the right to the Cuban people to live in peace without blockades or embargo damaging Cuban families, even Cuban families residents in the U.S. Territory, or even restricting the freedom to travel of American citizens. But there is a historical background, a very heavy burden to our economy, beyond $1 trillion in accumulation of economic damage, and it's impossible to express in figures the suffering, the shortages, the anxiety created to the Cuban people because of the embargo. But the main issue is that from the second half of 2019, the embargo, the blockade, has been strengthened in an inedit, unprecedented way. Our people was targeted with more than 200 additional sanctions, new list of especially designated national entities in Cuba, a ferocious persecutions of our financial transactions because of the arbitrary, unfair designation of Cuba as a country sponsors of terrorism. 9 days before the opening of President Biden's government in a highly politically motivated act. The blockade policy is anchored in the past, part of the Cold War, is illegal, is a gross violation of the international law, is a massive, flagrant, and systematic violation of Cuban rights, of human rights of all of Cubans, and suffer profound isolation and discredit worldwide. I'm sure that there is a historical trend favoring a better relations between the U.S. and Cuba, and I'm sure that the will of the American people, the Cuban people, our special cultural and emotional connections could lead the process for enhancing bilateral relations, having an equal footing, mutual respect, non-interference in internal affairs dialogue, and I'm sure that there is a positive trend, whatever happened in the next midterm election. President Biden, who is the 13th president implementing the blockade policy toward Cuba, or the next one or other, will have a better relationship as a neighboring countries and friendly peoples in both sides of the Florida Strait.
Have you heard of the US government putting pressure on countries to not vote against the blockade at the UNGA vote, or to comply with the blockade in practice, even if they do vote against it?
I heard and I live this process. I was ambassador to the United Nations for 10 years and enjoy my personal experience and my family experience and my boy growing up in New York. But I'm a privileged witness of this kind of pressures. I remember in a lounge in the headquarters of the UN headquarters called Indonesian Lounge, the advisor of the US president at this time, Richard Nuccio, making brutal pressures against diplomats of different countries. A set of threats, retaliations, very aggressive speech, maneuvers in different capitals, in different countries, deployment of officials by the Treasury Department, State Department, Commerce Department, and others. But in fact, the debate on this issue by the General Assembly is overwhelmingly in support of lifting the blockade that, as you just pointed out, the vote is almost unanimous. We'll have this issue and we have in the General Assembly coming early November. It could be the 30th time in which the international community will express almost unanimous will against the blockade on Cuba and against this proliferation of coercive sanctions. And our people follow this process with a great emotion and interest. It's a popular event in Cuba, this kind of debates, and I'm sure that there will be another overwhelming voting in favor of the international law, international humanitarian law, in favor of the cause of human rights for every human being, in favor of freedom to travel, of universal accepted rules of the international trade, free navigation, and against the extraterritorial implementation of national laws, and against the a very aggressive implementation against third countries entrepreneurs, Helms-Burton law.
30 years of overwhelming votes to end the blockade. That's a lot of time. I mean, some would argue that if an overwhelming number of countries are continuing to vote to end this blockade at the UN, but it hasn't ended, perhaps this points to a need for reforming the United Nations as a whole so that a handful of countries don't get to hold so much power. Does Cuba favor that?
It's true. We really need to defend the United Nations against unilateralism, supremacism, imperialistic domination on hegemonies, but at the same time, we have to make a profound reform of the United Nations. We the people is the beginning of the UN Charter, but unfortunately, the United Nations machinery is not too close to the feelings, to the needs, to the will of peoples. At the same time, we need to protect the United Nations Charter, especially its purposes and principles as a core element of the international law. We need to change the underrepresentation of South countries in some specific bodies as important as the Security Council, which usually operates on basis of a dark procedures, lack of transparency, lack of democracy, trying to interfere in the powers, in the very broad powers of the General Assembly, which is the universal democratic United Nations body. And my bottom line is that we need to reform the UN, but in a right direction, in favor of a further multilateralism, more democracy, better international overall, and a more equal and just international economic order.
Now, you mentioned earlier some optimism about this current administration in terms of the future relationship between Cuba and the US. Have you seen changes in US policy since Biden took office? And are there any discussions between Cuba and the US about returning to a policy of normalization, or what some might call the Obama policy?
We Cubans by culture are really optimistic, and I am on bilateral relations. I said that I'm really optimistic because of the historical trend. It's unavoidable, it's unavoidable. Unfortunately, there is an inertial effect, and President Biden inherited a brutal, cruel, cold-blooded policy against the Cuban people. Cuba deserves to live in peace, in a good relations with no blockades, no embargoes, no sanctions, damaging our people like any other country. But unfortunately, there is an inertial effect, and frankly speaking, the core of the current US government policy toward Cuba is a President Trump policy toward Cuba. Despite a very important political differences against the electoral platform, against the will of the voters, even the Cuban voters in Florida or New Jersey, who supported the election of President Biden. And it's unfortunate because we understand that the process occurred in the years 2014 to 2016, 2017. It's a solid demonstration of firstly, it's possible, it's a workable, it's viable to build a different relationship toward a normal relationship between US and Cuba, which never existed in our whole history. Well, maybe the original sin of this sick relation was the military occupation of Cuba and prevented our national independence late 19th century, and began a republic neo-colonized by the US in imperialism, frustrating our dreams of independence and freedom. From this point and to now, up to now, there is a core element on this policy, which is the interference in the self-determination of Cuban people, against the acceptance of Cuba as a small, friendly, neighboring country, but independent and sovereign country. And the core of this policy has been the blockade, the embargo policy, which is oppressive against all Cuban families. But despite some, the mere existence of both embassies, despite several restrictions, etc., targeting our embassy in Washington, despite the situation about the US consulate in Havana City, in which they cut consular services off in a very arbitrary and discriminatory, unsustainable decision. There are some channels of our communications. We have just had positive migratory talks, because migration is a fundamental issue between Cuba and the US. But the implementation of these more than 200 additional sanctions signed by executive decisions by President Trump's government is full in place. Same regulations, same practical aggressive behavior against Cuban interests. And but I see 2023 as a year of opportunity. Firstly, because of the overwhelming consensus in the Cuban people and a vast majority among American citizens. Because of the best interest of the majority of Cubans living in the US territory, because it's convenient for the US national interest and also the Cuban one. Cuba is a factor of stability in our region, preventing international crime organizations, acts, illegal narcotic drugs trafficking, terrorism crimes against the US, trafficking persons. And this is an important connection in a matter of national security and law enforcement. But additionally, we share common seas, the Mexican Gulf. We are neighboring countries. We have a very important environmental a connection between both countries. We enjoy a terrific mutual cultural influence. The Cuban jazz is among this expression, the Cuban fine arts, performing arts, Cuban music, Cuban salsa in the USA. A very strong cultural bond between both people. no feelings, no anti-American feelings in our people, a friendly, positive attitude, having consciousness between the difference of some policies by the U.S. governments and the soul, the essence of the American people. My guess is that next year there could be maybe additional opportunities for starting a positive dialogue between both governments. Will be always open to do so on equal footing, sovereign equality, mutual respect basis. Despite that, the terrible reversion of policies from 2014, 2015, 16, etc., which has suffered a terrible setback, and the international image and prestige of the U.S. government suffered pretty much because of lack of a state commitment, state serious behavior, and the abandoning, for instance, the Paris Agreement on climate change and on environmental issues.
The Iran nuclear deal as well. Yeah.
The nuclear deal, etc., made a terrible damage to the international situation, creating conditions for further conflicts and international problems. In a case of Cuba, it happened the same, but we are in a full will to resume these dialogues and negotiations. We'll do in good faith, and will judge by facts, by actual issues, not by smiles or diplomatic words or propagandistic or opportunistic announcement, etc.
You mentioned the state sponsors of terrorism list, and you mentioned that was a very politicized act on the part of the Trump administration before they left office. I'm curious, do you think the U.S. has any legitimate reasons to have placed Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list? As far as I understand it, the formal reason was that Cuba was hosting these delegations from Colombia that included combatants that the U.S. labels terrorists.
It's a pity, because anti-terrorism efforts is a real international priority. We badly need to enhance international dialogue and cooperation against terrorism. Secondly, I was here at this very place in Lexington and 38th Street in 9/11. And when the second tower collapsed, I walked toward the ground zero this morning in the midst of this terrible situation. I'll never forget this human experience. I went beyond the 14th Street, crossing with citizens covered by ashes and powder, and the whole city in panic, etc. And there was an opportunity for creating a powerful international consensus against terrorism. But it was frustrated by wars, by political manipulations of this issue. And it's a serious problem, the politicization, the political manipulation, the ideologically motivated manipulations on really important so-called global issues like terrorism, environment, migration, and others. Thirdly, Cuba has been historically victim of terrorism. 3,478 Cubans died because of terrorist Act. 2,099 persons suffered disabilities because of terrorist acts. Most of these terrorist acts were organized, granted by a generous financial resources and logistical resources from the US territory. Even Cubans, we were victims of state terrorism. Thirdly, Cuba is profoundly committed in our whole history from 1959 against terrorism. Any way, any motivation, any groups, any manifestation of terrorism, we acted with full energy and with the full weight of our laws and constitutions. And it has been reaffirmed in the last constitutional reform in 2019, and the new constitutions passed with an overwhelming support in an universal secret ballot national referendum with a support of more than 80% of our voters and participation of around 90% of Cuban voters. And the Constitution is crystal clear on the issue of terrorism and the commitment by the Cuban state and the Cuban government. Fourthly, I don't recognize any political, moral, or legal authority to the US government or to the State Department for writing unilateral, arbitrary list with no international mandate, no UN, no United Nations mandates or decisions, and I couldn't accept this role as a world judge and police, a role taken by the US government. And these lists are spurious and politically motivated in many different fields, from the religious freedom to efforts against trafficking persons, etc. And these kind of reports have been really slanderous against, for instance, the Cuban Medical International Cooperation, calling it as a modern slavery and making pressures against recipient countries with no consciousness of the suffering could provoke the lack of these medical services to poor people, vulnerable populations, remote villages in rural areas, etc. But on the concrete presence of Cuba in the list of countries sponsors of terrorism is enough to read the narrative, the report, in which there are no evidence, no facts, no concrete elements. And the pretext. The first one, the presence in Cuba of the ELN guerrilla movement, the Colombian ELN guerrilla movement, delegation for the peace process, for the peace talks. This delegation arrived to Havana City as a request of the Colombian president and Colombian states, with a recognition of 6 international guarantors, United Nations recognitions, with protocols agreed and signed by parties and by the international guarantors, and became pieces of international law. And there was a slanderous political manipulation with domestic purposes in some South American countries and even in the US. But 5 days after the opening of President Gustavo Petros, the new Colombian president, opening in Colombia, the foreign minister and the High Commissioner for Peace arrived to Havana City, met DLN delegation, recognized their legitimacy as a counterpart of the Colombian state for negotiating peace. Withdraw legal orders, criminal legal orders against them. Withdraw requests for extradition. Withdraw international Interpol red alert, this kind of things, and made an energetic and respectful appeal to the U.S. government to delete Cuba on this slanderous and fraudulent list. Second pretext, the presence of Cuban military personnel in Venezuela. Never happened. It's a political joke. One guy said 50,000 Cuban soldiers were deployed in Venezuela. It's a joke. The National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, a tough guy, was a little bit cautious and said not 50,000 but more than 20,000, which is another joke. But I feel that is a very positive, the evolution of the situation in Venezuela, its economic recovery, the consolidation of the constitutional government led by President Nicolás Maduro Moros, and even a better relationship with the U.S., some official talks, etc. And I hope that it could be a turning point in the U.S. government vision toward Latin America and the Caribbean, Venezuela, and Cuba, and not only an opportunistic action because of the oil needs after this very complicated international situation. Sorry for being too long.
No. That was all those were very important aspects of this issue. And I do think, though, something interesting that's taking place, at least domestically now in the U.S., is there's a politicization of the fact that there has been an increase in the number of migrants coming from places like Venezuela and Cuba. So I'm curious, how do you understand this phenomenon, and to what extent are the two countries, the U.S. and Cuba, talking about this issue of an increase in Cuban migrants?
There have been migratory flows from Cuba to the U.S. from centuries ago. The most intensive migration of Cubans to the U.S. was late 18th century. Tampa, Cayo Hueso have been very important historical cities and support of the patriotic Cuban emigration and as part of the national effort toward the national independence. Secondly, there is a new international phenomenon of circularity in the life of persons and citizens looking for better economic conditions, better jobs, better opportunities, and there is a dramatic change in the migratory flows. It's part of this new era with a different kind of air and maritime connection, or even in the digital era. Thirdly, there has been a tradition of an important migration and mutual visits between Cuba and the U.S. And we have a binding migratory agreements, 3 migratory agreements, stating legal obligations to both sides in place. The last one, it was 2017, during the 90s, the first two. But the U.S. government, unfortunately, from the last few years, unfulfilled their legal obligations. For instance, the US government is under the legal obligation to provide no less 20,000 migrant visas annual basis. But during the last years, the average was 3,000, 4,000, and there is a migratory potential accumulated. Secondly, there is a set of conditions encouraging the Cuban migration to the US. The first one is Rania, is the Cuban Adjustment Act. Could you imagine the situation if there could be a Central American Adjustment Act in place in the US, or some neighboring countries' Adjustment Act, or Latin American and Caribbean or Haitian Adjustment Act? The mere existence, the very existence of this law encourage the Cuban migrations. Maybe we Cubans are the only worldwide citizens who feel as a right to be received in the US as immigrants. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, there are very difficult economic conditions in Cuba because of the coincidence, the combined effect of the pandemic, COVID pandemic, with an important impact in our small economy. Even in the worst situation of the pandemic, the embargo was fully implemented. And when the US government decided to make exemptions in the implementation of coercive measures or sanctions in a universal way, Cuba was specifically deliberated, excluded of these exemptions. We couldn't import lung ventilators because of the blockade. We couldn't import medicine oxygen from the US in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Dozens and dozens of new sanctions were implemented in the peak of the COVID pandemic in 2021. Additionally, the international economic crisis has been a terrible impact in our economy. And the brutal strengthening of the US blockade from the 2019 has been terrible humanitarian consequences, depriving our social economic life, damaging the well-being of Cuban families. And there has been a creation of economic conditions which also promote the migration to the US. But lastly, and sorry for being long in my answer, the US government implemented a set of additional actions for preventing the Cuban migrations, making political pressures against a group of transit countries, restricting their visas for Cuban citizens, flights, this kind of things, which are harmful for the people and for the third countries. Instead, to implement in a coherent way the very restricted and I dare to say repressive and sometimes racist migratory policy implemented by the US governments with the terrible actions in the south border of this country, there have been a double standard there, feeding with this slanderous propaganda about the rational fear or justified fear or for political refugee or asylum seekers, etc., and discriminating Haitians, Latin Americans, Central Americans, Mexicans, etc., and granting a privileged status to the Cuban irregular migrants. we warned very early to the US government about the consequences of this non-serious, responsible, even illegal from the point of view of binding migratory agreements behavior by the US government. We encourage them to work together for preventing irregular, unsafe, unsecure flows of migrants, and to make a regular process to resume migratory talks. And in fact, we have a positive migratory talks and a positive announcement last week for the full resumption of our consular services in Havana City.
Okay, well, that's at least positive.
Yeah, it's a positive in the midst of this comprehensive negative situation. Because without changes in the core of the US policy toward Cuba, which is the blockade, which is the embargo, it's very difficult to implement important changes in bilateral relations.
You know, describing all of those shortages, it still is incredible that in many parts of the global South, Cuba is actually known as a country that gives a lot of aid, of help in terms of, you mentioned the medical brigades earlier, despite having so little itself. I'm curious, what motivates that, you know, given that Cuba suffers from all of these shortages you mentioned, what motivates this desire to help other, you know, developing countries in difficult situations?
It's part of the core of the Cuban soul, of the Cuban culture, the idea expressed by Jose Marti in the 18th century of we feel that homeland is humanity. It's a humankind. We see this small, contaminated blue planet in a very difficult conditions under threat of the climate change for the mere existence of the human species, or the threats from the nuclear weapons arsenals as a real problems and a challenge, a common challenge, in which the only way to deal with is international dialogue and cooperation. For instance, the vaccines against COVID. The world already produced vaccines for every human being on this planet. But the gigantic pharmaceutical transnationals made obscene profits. $183 billion in 2021 in the peak of the COVID pandemic, mostly with the COVID vaccines. But in Africa, there is no immunization. Last July, I visited 5 African countries. No level of immunization. Even in the US, there is a painful situation, having people under some belief, a prejudice, or even political manipulation against the vaccines treatments, or states in which the immunization level is so low. It's amazing that a small economy under blockade, poor in national resources, we could produce 5 vaccine candidates and have 3 very successful vaccines. The level of immunization in Cuba is optimus. The first pediatric vaccination program was in Cuba, not in Europe or even in the US. But at this very difficult moment, we decided to share our knowledge, our capabilities, our COVID protocols, a set of around 12 state-of-art new pharmacs for treating COVID and our vaccines. And when in Cuba, our intensive care units were full, in the medicine oxygen crisis, overwhelmed our healthcare sector, etc., by this inedit situation. We dispatched more than 50 medical brigades specialized in epidemic conditions, etc., to more than 40 countries and territories. Not only South territories. We dispatch medical personnel to Italy, to Andorra, to other countries. And in Haiti is a nation who deserves international cooperation and a minimum of generosity, even for the responsible of the situation in Haiti, the former colonial powers and the powers in our region. We have had medical presence in Haiti for decades. 32 million of medical consultations were performed by Cuban doctors in Haiti. Millions of Haitians immunized with the vaccines against different communicable diseases. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deliveries attended by Cuban personnel. And if Cuba could do it, why not to make a substantial international effort for this small, proud country and culture, always oppressed because of some retaliatory sense, because Haiti is the first anti-slavery and social revolution in this in our region. And we feel as a duty, and we have to meet our duties in the most humble, modest way, to share our small resources, to share our knowledge, to share our highly qualified labor personnel. 67% of Cuban high qualified labor force are women. It's a blessing, and we have to share that. And it's part of our culture, our soul, to help others, even when we suffer the worst situations.
And I just very quickly want to note, I mean, something about you that many people don't know is that you actually volunteered in Angola. I'm curious, what was it about the struggle against apartheid that inspired so many Cubans to go fight against it?
I remember when Katrina hurricane beaten New Orleans and other regions, this tragic situation. And a government saying, run, evacuate yourself, and seeing this painful abyss between rich people and poor people in New Orleans. And immediately we make a call to the Cuban medical personnel, and we received thousands of volunteers, and we made an offer to the US government to dispatch medical personnel to New Orleans. The governor accepted, the mayor of the city accepted, but the federal government refused to do so. It was very altruistic, because we never mix politics or political issues with the humanitarian affairs. And it was the beginning of this special medical force called Henry Reeve, honoring an American youth fighting in our independence wars. And we are Latin American, African people. It's in our blood, it's in our culture. We inherited from Spain and from Africa. And we saw it also in New Orleans or in the Hispanic population on these countries and other, this crossroad of cultures. And we feel as sons and daughters of Africa, and we feel committed there. We have no racial approach because of our history. The Cuba's nation has a peculiarity of the very idea of national identity, of the Cuban identity, and as an independent nation was born at the same time and in a blood connection with the ideal of abolition of slavery. And the founding fathers call them compatriots and call rich, illustrated, first Cubans owners of sugarcane plantations, sugar mills, and slave dotation. Very poor Cuban workers, Spanish descent, almost in slavery conditions, paying with the food, and call Africans and African defense, and call all of them fellow citizens, compatriots, and invited them to fight a war for the national independence and for the abolition of the slavery. It's in the roots of our national essence. We received an emotional solidarity by African countries, and we were involved because of these profound cultural connections in their independence struggle against colonialism and against the crime of apartheid. I'll never forget the complicity of some Western governments, even the US governments, calling that this complicity a constructive engagement with the supremacist, racist South African white regime. And we felt as a duty to be part, to make a humble contribution to this struggle. And in fact, more than 300,000 Cubans participated in the struggle against the apartheid only in Angola. Never been involved in internal affairs or in internal conflict in Angola, only defending their borders against the apartheid. And in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, many officials had this experience as a young officer. In my delegation currently, Cosillo is one of them. 3 of us participated personally. Our ambassador to the United Nations. And for this reason, we feel that the struggle against racism and against racial discrimination is fundamental. And the attempt to use these issues as a political threat against South countries or against Cuba, for instance, is a painful. It's the same as I just pointed out about manipulation of a really important human causes. In the first independence wars, African descent and Africans, free slave, fought in a decisive contribution to our national independence, but they were the infantry. But in the Second War, many generals were African descent. And it was a very, very important a result of our independence process to have a different vision on races. But during the first half of our 20th century, the new colonial republic, kidnapped by American interests, imposed an amendment to our constitutions, was a setback. And during the 50s in Cuba, there was a terrible racism and racial discrimination. Separated institutions, clubs, even towns in which no a black person, no a mulatto person could walk freely. But the Cuban Revolution changed that by law and by social conquers, by social policies, creating equal opportunities, or even compensating structural historical inequalities with additional opportunities.
And one last thing I want to ask you about is you mentioned the word manipulation a few times, and I think one of the ways we're seeing a lot of manipulation right now is in the internet space. In some cases, it's just blatant censorship, like you see a lot of Russian media being censored in the Western countries. But I've heard you talk about something that's even more nefarious in many ways, which is this dictatorship of algorithms, as you've put it. Can you explain what you mean by that phrase and how that impacts Cuba?
I was amazed reading a very long list of books prohibited in schools, libraries in this country. I was amazed by that. But I remember during our talks in 2014, 2015, one of our main issues in which the US side was really interested was internet and the digital technologies and telecom technologies. The telecom companies made an important contribution, pioneering these political talks between both governments, like Google, for instance. And we opened our business with American telecom companies in a very open-minded way up to now. The only restriction for that is part of the blockade policy, unfortunately, preventing the Cuba's connection to the cables around our island, connectivity cables, I mean. Secondly, at this moment, the internet penetration in Cuba was low. Today, it's among higher in our region. And the rate of progressing in internet penetration is maybe the highest in our region. And internet and mobiles, etc., in our view, is a fundamental, fabulous tool for fraternity, solidarity, education, culture, knowledge, science. But at the same time, digital networks have been weaponized politically, or even the cyberspace has been weaponized in an actual way. I mean, for implementing military actions and deploying military weapons in the cyberspace, creating new commands, not only in the US, but in NATO headquarters, a very aggressive military doctrine in a way of the so-called fifth generation wars, these kind of things, making the brain and the social consciousness in a new battleground, even military battleground. There are terrible toxical platforms based mostly in Florida, targeting our youth, our people, through digital networks in a ferocious way. Slanderous, lying, threatening people, very bad manners, or even instigating violence or even terrorism. Up to now, yesterday, I could share with you some posts from yesterday calling for violent events in Cuba because of blackout conditions, manipulating this sad moment in our country. Digital networks are a marvelous tool, but at the same time, a very sharp political tool, and we need to explain our truths, our reasons, to make our contribution to the international debate, political debate, to advance our ideas, also through digital networks, and we are doing that with no prejudices. But digital networks created a sense of freedom, liberty, democracy, which is in a strong contradiction with the private property in a handful of gigantic companies, most of them, or all of them, Americans, of technological platforms and decision makers about which we could read or not, which could be avoided or not, and even implemented political operations, slanderous political operation, manipulating consumers, electors, children in a very difficult way. It's a reason of our view in order to implement fully the full possibilities of these new technologies as a tool favoring the truth, the harmony, the fraternity, the solidarity, the education, the culture, and at the same time will keep our struggle, even our political struggle, also in digital networks.